All right, so for this little lecture, we're going to look at some specific method examples, and we're going to replicate the system.out.print and .println with our display method as we saw before, and we're going to introduce some new input methods, very similar to that method that was basically replicating all the scanner class and the input string and all that stuff. So it just sort of wrapped it up and encapsulated it quite nicely. But we're going to try and make it extremely useful because we don't want to do all that extra work in our main method. We just want to call these simple methods. So we'll see how that works out. And we'll definitely be implementing polymorphism on this one. So let's take a look at what we're going to create. So the idea is we're going to create a set of output methods and a set of input methods to make our lives a little easier while we're programming. So for the output methods, we're definitely going to have a display method, and that one's going to be output to the console with no new line. And we're also going to implement a display line. So output to the console with a new line. So that'll be similar to .print and .println. So we're going to have the same capability because we want to have that, the option of being able to output something without going to the next line and also just simply going there. We don't have to worry about putting a \n or a new line character. For the input methods, we're going to do sort of the same idea. We're going to have multiple methods that are going to provide us with some flexibility. And that's where all this polymorphism is coming from. So we're going to have one called input string. So that will input a whole string from the console. So input a whole string. So that'll be similar to the next line that we do with the scanner class. So it's going to grab everything until the user types enter. We're also going to have input, let's say input word, which will be input a single word. So that'll be just where we do .next, where we just get the string and it stops with space. So separated with space. So we only want to get that small string. We don't want to get everything until the user types enter. We're also going to do input int. So input an integer. And let's say input double, because that's very useful. We don't want to get too crazy, but you know what? Why don't we just add input char as well? So input character. Now, the one thing I want to add to these input methods is something that we always have to deal with. So the input methods with display of a user prompt. So whenever we've done scan.next, scan.nextLine, scan.nextInt, whatever, it literally just waits, grabs whatever's on the console input stream, and it returns it. It doesn't display anything to the user, it's just getting it. So we always have to be responsible for adding the prompt to the user, where we ask the user, please enter your name, enter the age, enter the value that they need to enter. But you know what? Why don't we have the method do that for us? Why have two statements, one to display a prompt and the other one to do the input? Why don't we just have the one method which does everything for us? And that's how we should always be looking at methods. Can they encapsulate an entire idea? And in this case, the idea would be display a prompt, get the input from the user, and return it. And that's what we want to do. We want to look at all of these. So we'll come back to that list, but let's go over to our little program here that we've been working on. And let me just rename this guy to, let's see, this will be methods, so method, input, and output. So we're going to call it that, so we'll change the name here. And we'll start with pretty much what we have. So we've got the get inputs, the get input method, which we're going to rename. We've got our display method as well. But if we go back to what we have here, we've got the two display methods, and we've got a number of input methods. And surprisingly, we're not actually going to do that much work. It looks like we're going to be adding a lot of stuff, but really we don't have to. Let's take a look at the very first one, that display method. So the display method here, we've got where it displays with a string. So you pass into it a string, it displays it on the screen, and everybody's happy. So we also want to do a display line. So let's add that one in there as well. So public static. It'll also be void because it's a display, it's not returning anything. And we'll call it display line, just like systemout.println, and it will also have a string that it needs to display. And you would be thinking that what we really want to do is just emulate println and display the message. But that is actually not a very lazy way to do it. We already have a method that does the display, and that's the display method we've got here. It's always displaying to the console. Why do we want to do systemout.print and systemout.println? We can actually just call the display method above. So we've already seen this idea of polymorphism. We can have methods calling methods. We can have methods with different names. So why don't we just have this method, display line, call the display method? And the only thing that makes it different is that this one displays a new line. And the best way to do that is just literally add a new line. So we'll just concatenate a new line character into that string. So now we're going to display the message and put a new line at the end. So in a way, we've only got one display method, this one, which calls systemout.println. If we call display line with a message, we're just going to call the display method up here with a slightly different string, which is just got the new line concatenated to the end. So let's just see what the effect is of this. So we'll do a display here of, let's see, what would be my favorite string? Bumblebees. And then we'll do a display line of more bumblebees. See the effect is. And then we'll tap it off with a display here of the end. So what we should see is outputting that string there, the first one, should display bumblebees, but won't put a new line, so the cursor waits at the end. Then we're going to display this one, which is going to put out more bumblebees, tacked on to the end of the previous string, but this one puts a new line at the end, so the cursor then will advance to the next line, and we will display the end. So let's see if this even compiles. Okay, what am I missing here? Oh, well, we've got the scanner class and so on. So I've got to fix that. So let's see, int can be converted to a string, so I need to change that to an int just to let it compile. And let's see, so yes, so we've got bumblebees up here. So it displays bumblebees, then it goes down, or it doesn't go down to the next line, it displays more bumblebees on the same line, but display line adds that new line character, which we see here, to the output string, so it went to the next line, and then we just did the end. But if you notice, that one didn't have the line at the end, so our cursor just waited there at the end of that line, didn't go to the next line. So awesome, we now have these two methods here, display and display line. With the beautiful thing is, this just calls the other display method. Now you'll notice the syntax that we're using. Whenever we just talk about a method, we just put its name and open close parentheses. We don't have to describe what it does and the fact that it's got a string inside. Using this notation here should be clear that we're calling a display method. Which one we're calling? Well, it actually really doesn't matter. It's not until we actually use it do we care which one. We just know that we're calling the display method. So that's all good and well. But what about this one? What if we just wanted to display a line all by itself, but no prompt? What if we wanted to add display line? Like that. We do have a systemout.println, which does something similar to it. So how can we replicate that? Well, once again, we could go down here and we can add public static void display line. This one doesn't have any parameters, so we're going to describe it without parameters. And we would think that we would, well, why don't we just do a systemout.println all by itself? And that would actually be perfectly fine, except for the fact we didn't do it for this one. So why do we want to do it for this one? Why do we want to call systemout.println? Well, we don't have to. We can just call display line with an empty string, because nothing gets displayed on the screen. And that's exactly what we're saying here. There's nothing to display. So display nothing, and display line goes and puts a new line in there anyways. So that should work perfectly well. And that's exactly what it did. So we had bumblebees show up, no new line at the end. Bumblebees then gets printed, but that was with the display line method. So we went to the next line, we displayed the end which just had the display method, but then we did a display line, no argument value. There's no parameter here, and all it does is does a display, and it goes to the next line. Now we could also have written it this way, and either way will be perfectly valid. We could call display, and we could just pass into it a new line character. So there's two ways that we could have written that method, and they're both equally fine. This one I think is just a little bit cooler because this method calls the previous method, which calls the previous method to eventually print out something. And there we have that level of all three display methods actually working out very nicely. So let's go back over to this over here. So we've got the display methods. Now, there's a terminology which I haven't used yet, but now that we've been talking about polymorphism so much, we've got the display and the display line, display working out very nicely. Let's take a look at adding one more display method, and I'll come back to a specific piece of terminology. With display here, we just display strings. We're not displaying anything else. So how can I do a display of an integer, like 2? If I actually try and compile this, what Java should tell me is that I don't have a method with a name called display and a parameter that's an integer. So what am I going to do? Well, I could just rewrite one and just do a systemout.print. It seems to be able to take integers. But if you think about our methods, we have a name called display, but nothing here matching an integer. So why don't we just add that one as well? We'll add it underneath display so that the names follow suit. So in this case, we will add a public static void. It doesn't return anything. Its name is called display, and it will be an integer. So int value. And you would think, again, possibly that we could do a systemout.print of value, and everyone would be happy. Except we already have something called display which displays stuff. Why can't we use it? Why can't we just say display value? Well, the same problem as we had up here. We don't have anything that has an integer, but we do have something which is a string. So why don't we just concatenate value against an empty string? So this effect will be creating a string. So now we have display of a string. So with a very simple statement, I've now introduced display of integers. So let me add some documentation here. So this will be display an integer with no new line. And for this one right here, display a new line. And now if I compile it, we should have the display of 2 at the very end. And there we go. We've got a 2 at the very end. Oh, and of course we're now tired of trying to figure out all these options. We have a display line that we need to figure out. where we have a display of, let's say, the value of 3, but with a new line, I try and compile it. It tells me the same problem. I don't have a method called display line with an integer, so I might as well just add that one as well. So I'm just going to copy, let's say this one, paste it down here. So this will display an integer with a new line. So we need a parameter here, which is going to be our value. Same idea. This one is supposed to do a display of the value with a new line. So why don't we just concatenate this with value as well? So the other option, we could have done a display of value with a new line like that, and that would have been perfectly fine as well. Just a similar idea as we had of this one. The effect is, of course, we now have a display line method that also gives us a display of an integer. And there we go. We displayed the 2 without the new line, and then the 3 with a new line, and we see that the cursor is now waiting on a line by itself. Awesome. Look at all that. All those display methods, it looks like there's only 2, display and display line, but we actually have a lot of them. And it didn't take that long to write. And the reason is, it all comes back to this one single method, which actually displays to the console. All these other methods are just eventually calling that one. So let's go back over here. So what we've got, I think we've pretty much nailed the display methods. We could probably add more for doubles and chars and strings and all the various combinations, but I'm not going to worry about that. What we'd end up doing is just leaving it as display and display line and letting the programmer who's calling these methods do the concatenation on their own, so that we don't have individual displays for integers and displays for doubles. But again, the Java programmers have provided systemout.print and println with all these options because it didn't really take that long for them to do it. Programmers are lazy, so they want to provide the most flexibility, the best options with the least amount of effort. So it's actually really well done. Now, that term I was going to come back to, we've been using this term polymorphism to say many faces. So the display method definitely has many faces. In the C, C++ language, and some other ones, this actually has a very, very special name. This one is called overloading. So it's the idea of overloading a method name. What does overloading a method name mean? Well, if we go back to the display method, we've used that name for more than one method. So it's an overloaded name. It has a lot of weight to it. And it depends on how you call it, what the argument value is. Is it a string? Is it an integer? Is it a double? What is that value? That's when Java will determine what it actually needs to call. So it's going to find the appropriate method by matching the header. How does it do that? It uses the method signature. And the method signature is the name and the data type in the parameter list. And we also know that as the method header, which is the name and the actual value here, which is string or the message being a string. I'm just getting excited about all this because it's so much code that seems to be getting written with actually very little effort. So next up, we're going to write all these inputs. Now, this one looks like it's going to take a little while, so I'm going to write a couple right now, and then I'll do a pause and fill them up really quickly. So let's write the very first one, the input string method. So we've currently got something called getInput. So I'm going to rename this one and call it input string. So it's going to get an a string from the user. So it's going to return that string. So get string from console and return it, but also display prompt to console. So it's going to display a prompt. So this is where that prompt comes in. So I'm going to adjust the header here. So the prompt. So what does that mean to display the prompt? Well, I've already got all this scanner stuff going on. So it's going to input a string. So I'm going to get the entire line. That's what the input string method is. If we go back over to our note, this inputs the whole string. So it's similar to .next line. So we've got the next line going on here. but I want to display a prompt to the screen. So I'm just going to call my display method, and I'm going to display the prompt. That's it. So that the user knows what to type in. Then the user will go ahead and type it in, and that will get returned. And we've already declared our scanner here. Beautiful. So let's actually try that. Let's clean up some of this code here. Don't need that anymore. And let's say the user is going to type in a string. So we'll just call this one temp string. And I'm going to get it. So I'm going to call input string, and I'll say type in your name. And that will get returned, stored over here. And then I'm just going to display the name in uppercase. So display temp string to uppercase. So this will not only display the prompt, it will get the input from the user, and this will display it. So let's see what happens here. Oh, type in your name. All right, Bob Smith, and it displays Bob Smith in uppercase. Maybe I should go to the next line. There, I'll just call my display line method. So we've encapsulated a lot of activity here. The input string displays to the user whatever is being passed into the prompt seen on the screen. The user types in whatever they have that's captured with the scan.next line, and that string that's returned from this statement is then put over here to temp string, and we display it. Fantastic. I'm loving this. All right, so now we've got the input string method. So one more to add before we do some cleanup, input word. Input word. So that's where we use the next instead of the next line. So we could think about how we could split stuff up and capture just the particular word, stopping at a space. But in this case, because the next line and the next methods actually perform something rather different, it might actually be easier and super lazy to literally just copy paste it. So we're still going to do the display of the prompt. So we're going to still have a prompt in there. So string, this will be a word style. It's not going to be the entire phrase. We're going to display it, we're going to capture it, but in this case, we're just going to do a next. There's no really simple way of having this one call the input string method to actually do the input. And the reason is this one is returning back a next line, this one is returning back a next. Unlike display where we build something up, we can actually make it more and more complex before we display it. The idea of input, we can't really keep reducing it until we get some input. So this might be the laziest way to do it. So let's see what happens. I'll clean this up here. Let's see what we've got. So I should change this one to input word. There we go. So I just want that single string. I don't want everything the user is going to type in. So type in your name. Now if I type in Bob Smith, what should happen is only Bob should get returned, because that's what the next method for the scanner class is doing. And I've called input word. So I'm going to just type in Bob Smith, and it should only display Bob in uppercase with a new line. Awesome. So now I have an input string and an input word. I don't have to do any of the scanner stuff or any of the scan.next line or .next. This method is doing everything for me. Now, this example is not polymorphism. So input string and input word are not polymorphism, nor are they overloading, because the name of the method is completely different. Input str versus input word. And if we go over to the code, these are completely different. They're easy to tell apart. Even though the parameter is the same, they both have a string parameter, the name is different. So that the method itself, if you look at the method header, the name and the string is different, which means Java is seeing a completely different signature for both of these. They're not even remotely considered the same. So there is no overloading or polymorphism. But from a programmer point of view, input string, input word, my God, they're so similar to each other. They're almost the same method, but they do perform something different. So I'm going to just pause here. I'm going to fill up the other ones, and we'll come back and we'll look at what those are. All right, so we're going to look at input int, input double, and input char. So we've already got input str, which inputs an entire string, everything until the user presses enter. Input word, which is everything that's a single word or up until the space for the input. Now input int, input double, and input char are going to be a little different. These aren't just text strings. These are actually values that are probably stored in whatever the user typed in. But how can we use the least amount of code, or maybe use the previous methods? How can we have these call input string and input word? I mean, if we've got these methods, let's see if we can actually use them. So let's pop over to our code, and I've already got input int working here. So the idea is that we're going to return an integer. So a little copy paste from the other methods. It's going to be called input int, and it's going to display a prompt, and it's going to return the integer. So we'll take a look at how that's called. So let me do a couple of fixes here for the other methods, which I neglected to do. So this is going to be input double. So input double. This is going to be input char. And if you can see how I've actually written some of these. So we're going to investigate them just a little bit here. So get char, and that's going to be get a double. And I think we've got it. So let's take a look at input int here. Let me just do one quick compile. Just want to make sure it all works out. So scan dot next double. That's what that should look like. There we go. So all my code is at least compiling. I don't know if it works, but it's at least all compiling. So for input int, I still want to display a prompt to the user, so I've still got that prompt there. So if I called it, it would look something like this. It would be int value as assigned input int type in an integer, and then we'll just display it. And if you remember, we've got a display line method that can display integers. So we can go ahead and use that. So display value. Perfect. So I'm going to comment out this one here. And let's just run it before we analyze it. What am I missing? Input int. Ooh, it doesn't have anything called input int because I can't type. There we go. Input int. So I'll type in the number 42, everybody's favorite integer, and we display a 42 on the screen. So with the input int method, what we've got is using the input word method. That's sort of interesting. But input word returns back a string. So how can we convert it from a string to an integer? Well, we can use the wrapper class here and its static method called parseInt. And parseInt takes in a string and it returns back an integer, which we then assign into value. So I could have done it this way. I could have just used nextInt. So basically copy pasted this method and just used nextInt. But I thought, could I rewrite this so I don't have to worry about all that? I just want to go ahead and use one of the methods I've already got. Now it looks like a lot of code is going on in here. And actually, in a way, there is a lot of code. But I can actually streamline this just a little bit. Because input word takes the prompt, displays it to the user, and it returns back a string. Well, that's exactly what parseInt wants, is a string. So I'm going to take this out here and put in the entire call for this inside the parseInt method. There we go. Which means I don't need the input string at all. I just need the value. Now, if we look at it, isn't this the integer that we're actually returning? So value doesn't really, in a way, have any value. That's the actual value we need to return back. So why don't we just take this out and put that in its place. So we'll just take that out and put it in here. So then we've got everything going on in one line of code. And if you notice with this, we don't have any scanner, we don't have any display. We let input word with the prompt do the display on the screen. It will go ahead and create the scanner, which is exactly what input word does. It returns back a string, and that is then parsed as an integer by the integer wrapper class method, and that's the integer which gets returned. So let's compile this guy. We will then run it. Everyone's favorite integer 42, and it works perfectly. So we've taken those, what looked like maybe 4 or 5 lines of code, and reduced it down to literally one line of code, which should be rather straightforward to anybody looking at it. We're calling the input word method, which has a string, which is the prompt we display to the user. We then take that string, we then parse it to grab the integer that's inside it, and then we return that integer, which is exactly what the input int method does, is it returns back an integer. So that is actually a very efficient piece of code. It looks like it's doing a lot of work, and in a way it is. But from a program perspective, we've taken a lot of lines of code, reduced it down to a relatively clear one line. This isn't just to introduce confusion, this is just to make the code very efficient. Now, if we didn't want to go down that route of actually doing all this methods, calling methods, and changing data around, we could have just left it just like I've written the input double method, where we do a display of the prompt, we declare our scanner inside, and then we do a next double to grab that double value from the input stream, and we return it, which is very similar to the input word method. There's nothing wrong with this. This is a programming style, but with this one, we're very dependent on having declaring of the scanner inside this code. Now, it doesn't mean that if we'd use the input int method, it doesn't declare a scanner, but it actually does. And that's what the input word method. So we're not really saving any processing. The input int method here, which looks very efficient, and then the input double method, which looks a little bit fatter and heavier, still perform the exact same amount of work. Because we still have to declare a scanner, we still have to do the work of grabbing from the input stream, but it's how we approach that. So let's go up here and do a little copy paste. We will then input a double value. So we'll declare a double here. So value double, type in a double, and we'll display it. So let's compile this guy. Oh, what am I missing? I completely forgot. We don't have a display line that does double values. Okay, so let's go down to the bottom and write, why should we go ahead and write another method? As I was saying, if we don't have something that does it for display line, really all we're doing is just this. We're just taking that value and concatenating it. If we go down and look at the integer, that's all we did. For display line of integer, we just concatenated it with a string. So I'm going to be a super lazy programmer and just go ahead and do that. Which means I don't actually even need a display line or a display for integers. In my program, I could just do something similar to this. Amount of code is about the same. So let's run it. So we'll type in an integer, everybody's favorite integer, type in a double, everyone likes a slice of pie, and oh, what happened here? So, because I am not as smart as I think I am. So what we have for input double is a call that shouldn't be an integer. So call the right method and everything will work out. My apologies for that. So we'll type in 42, 3.14, and there's our double value. Perfect. So just goes to show that coding is all about not just compiling. You do have to run the program to test it. So we've got all that working out. And if we look at the last one, which is input of a character. So the input of a character, use the approach that we did for double up here. Why did we use this one? Why did we use this approach of input word? Well, the problem with the scanner class, it does not have a simple way to input a character. So if we wanted to do an input of a character, we would have to do something similar to this. We would have to do scan.next, which would get a whole string stopping at the space, and then we'd have to figure out the character at the very first position. Well, if we're already doing that, isn't scan.next, isn't that literally what input word does? It's actually doing a dot next instead of a dot next line. And since input word displays the prompt, I'm just passing the prompt along. I take whatever string comes back from input word, and I'm grabbing the first character out of it. So input character should work just fine as well. So let's take a look at that. So we'll come down here, we'll declare a character, we'll call it letter. We'll give it, let's initialize it at 0. It's an integer, so we can do that. Let's see. So we will then, letter is going to be input char of enter a letter. And we're going to do a quick test by entering a string and seeing what happens with that one. So now we'll do a display line of letter. Now, if we try and compile it, we're probably going to find that we can't actually do this because we don't have a letter. It's going to complain about that, but it didn't. Interesting. Let's see what happens if we run it. So enter an integer, 42, 3.14. Now it's asking for a letter, so let's type in a B, and it said 66. Well, that's unexpected. Why is it unexpected? Why did it compile? Why did it even run? Well, this was the trick that I mentioned up here. So we initialize character with an integer, because a character, or a char data type, really is an integer. So if we look down here, what we have for input character is we have a prompt that we pass in, which is enter such and such. Here we return back the character at position index 0. We're returning back a character, which is perfectly fine. Is there anything unexpected here? I don't think there's anything crazy going on. But it's the display line. So this is a char here. But when we call display line, we don't have a matching character data type. At best, we have an integer. So we have this value here. Now, if you remember anything about your data types, we can do a promotion automatically. So Java will do it. It will go from a low data type to a high data type. So if we look at the integers, we've got char, short, int, long. So what Java's doing is it sees that we're trying to pass in a character, but a character is a type of integer. And that's literally what we have here, display line of an integer. So then Java just says, oh, an integer, I'm going to just call this as an integer. So it matches the signature of display line integer. And that's unexpected. Although it compiles and it runs perfectly, that's why we get a 66 instead of the letter B. So there's a couple of ways to fix it. One way would be to write a distinct display line for a character, or we'll just go ahead and use this idea of casting. So what we've got is casting a string with a character and actually getting it to display that character. So let's see what happens if we try this. So now we're going to call the display line with a string. So get a 42 in there, 3.14, and what happened now? Input double. So it failed because I can't type. So when I typed in my 3,14, it didn't work. So let's run that one more time. So 42, 3.14, and the letter B, and now we get a B on the screen because we're doing our concatenation with a string. So we're not calling the display line with an integer anymore, we're calling display line for a string. all glorious. Now I'm going to run it one more time because I wanted to try typing in a string for the last one, and just to make sure that it picks off just the first character. So we'll do a 42 there, 3.14, and Bob. Perfect, it picks off just the first character. It doesn't fail or anything that there's more in the input stream, but it only is picking off the first character, which is exactly what we have going on here. Just pull off the first character. So there's a bunch of methods that we've written. So we've got a bunch of display line methods and a bunch of extremely useful input string, input word, input int, input double, input char. We could probably change it to input short and input anything else that we want. But we've reduced down, instead of having to do all the display for the prompt, the declaration of the scanner, the taking in of the input, we've reduced all of that work by just being able to say input a double. So we've reduced all of that work of just doing the display of the prompt, the conversion of the input, and returning it to just one simple little method. Input double, input int, input char. And in a way, we've done the same thing for display. We've reduced down a longer line of system out blah blah blah, just down to a very simple, just display what I want to display. So that was a very simple example of actually doing what seems to be a very complicated task of doing all this extra work. So in the next method finishing up, we're going to just do some methods where they do some calculations and some processing. So what we normally have done in the main method, we're just going to move it down into a method call on its own, and we can repeat that method call over and over again with different types of data. We don't have to repeat that action, copy paste, or over and over again in the main method. So thanks again, and see you in the next virtual lecture.